What's up, y'all? This will be, I guess, my second video on this channel, but the first review I do on this channel. I plan on doing these reviews for each game I finish in any given year. I'm going to try to keep them short. I just took a first take of this, and I was rambling way too much. Keeping them short, keeping them, 10 to 15 minutes. Hold me to it. Hopefully that's where I, come in at. But we will be looking at Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2. And I'm going to do a 2026 PowerPoint review of this video game. Okay, so in this review, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the game, kind of, when did this game come out, who developed it, that sort of thing. Just an overview of where this game falls kind of in history. Then I'm going to discuss my spoiler-free thoughts on the game, both like the gameplay, the story, everything like that. I will either then recommend the game or not recommend the game, and then I'll briefly discuss some spoiler thoughts on the game. So just thoughts that, involve spoilers that I think they're interesting to discuss, but like I wanted to place these after a recommendation in case somebody else watches this review other than myself, and, actually wants to use it. Like, oh, I now find this game worth checking out, but I don't want it to have, be spoiled, so putting those after the recommendation, I'll make it clear when I'm going to start spoiling aspects of the game. Okay, so history of Knights of the Old Republic 2. The game was released in December of 2004 on Xbox only. It later came out on PC the next year, early the next year, which I thought was interesting. KOTOR 1 came out, I think, simultaneously, PC and Xbox, and I actually associate that game more with its PC version than Xbox. I don't know if that's just me personally, but KOTOR 2 was first and foremost an Xbox game. It was developed by Obsidian. This is a change. It was published by LucasArts, same as Knights of the Old Republic 1, but Obsidian took the reins over from BioWare, mostly because BioWare did not feel they had time to complete the game, and this makes a lot of sense when you look at the fact that development on this game didn't begin until October of 2003, and the game released in December of 2004, so just over a year, which, thinking about modern, timelines for game development, like, that's such a short period of time, and I think it did lead to some of the, the issues that both I have or certainly that, game journalists more broadly had with the game. I wouldn't, okay, so the game was pretty well received when it first came out. I've got an asterisk here, 86% Metacritic. I didn't really get into looking into okay, are some of these reviews well after the fact, or all of these of period, so it could have been that Metacritic was actually a little lower if you just included reviews that were that occurred or were written in 2004, 2005. But that being said, I remember the game being fairly well received, and the 86 sounds about right. 8 out of 10 from a lot of outlets. A lot of people, the critiques they had with the game were that the game was filled with some bugs and glitches. I don't necessarily remember anything or anyone writing about game-breaking bugs or glitches, but there certainly were, a fair number of them. The game felt unpolished. It also felt unfinished, and I think this was a sentiment carried by a lot of game developers at the time. There are story hooks that in the released version of this game just never have a conclusion in the game. There are certain quests that start that there just isn't a finish, a completion to the quest built into the game, which, these all scream to the fact that, started development in October 2003, released in December 2004. That's not a lot of time, and I think that's a very clear parallel to those being the issues with the game and that being the development cycle. So I think that certainly speaks to Obsidian. Had they had more time, maybe those things wouldn't have been issues with this game. That being said, even with the flaws, people were really praising the game's story, and the places it goes with its writing, with its character development, and things like that. All things that I feel myself, and I'll get into a little bit more shortly. And just to kind of speak to that, GameSpot was a fairly prominent uh, video game news outlet at the time, and they gave it their RPG of the year, which I think speaks to like the quality of the game. It's a very good game. It wasn't winning a lot of Game of the Years. It was up against some really stiff competition with the likes of like Half-Life 2 and Halo 2, other big tentpole releases at the time. But it was certainly a standout in the RPG genre. Okay, so now I'm going to get into kind of my thoughts on the game. We'll talk a little bit about the gameplay. I won't get too specific with how the gameplay works, but I'll talk a little bit about that and just kind of my thoughts on it. The game is based on a system, a D&D system, known as 3rd Edition. I've never played D&D 3rd Edition. From what I understand, this is a fairly heavily modified version of that system, D&D 3.5 specifically. But because of that, it's a system that works on dice rolls, and so the game occurs in live action, but whether you hit or miss and how much damage you do are all based on rolls of the dice that are influenced by your character's stats and your character's gear and all of that stuff. So there's kind of a disconnect where like you're seeing things happen in live action, but it's all based on stats. So even if you like your lightsaber hits an enemy, that doesn't necessarily mean you hit. And this is the same sort of thing with like games like Morrowind, where like that disconnect I think can really turn people off or confuse people. But once you understand the systems, they do work fairly well. And I found that like playing with those D&D systems, the further I got into the game, the more enjoyable it was. Like it was fun to really like max out certain stat attributes and then see that the reward of my character just like never missing with certain types of weapons, for example, or doing just like extreme amounts of damage with certain attack types. And that's certainly possible. You can not necessarily quote unquote break this game, but you can certainly manipulate it to the point that it becomes very easy near the end of the game. And I'll talk about difficulty a little bit more in a second, because I think that's a key aspect of this game. This game, you have a lot of force powers to choose from, and all of them are kind of fun to use. You've got your like standard buffs and things like that, but then you've also got a lot of different attacks, both light side and dark side attacks. But even if you're not like a dark side Jedi, you have access to those dark side powers. They just cost more mana, essentially, right? Your force power meter. But you could even mitigate that through like upping certain stats, which is how I approach the game. So like you could be a light side Jedi that's just like force lightning everybody, which is kind of how I played the game. The one downside I would say is like there are quite a number of traits and attacks and things like that are not force related, but that being said, like the characters that have no force powers feel less useful in combat. I found them generally to just be worse. They don't really have any attributes. Like the force characters have all the you could load them up with all the attributes that the non-force characters have, so they just inherently have an advantage over some of these non-force characters, at least in my opinion. I am by means no expert on these systems, but that's kind of how I felt. It was just kind of hard to justify them being in my party. I did enjoy talking to those party members, and I think they're good characters, and they are forced into your party at times, but anytime I had to choose, I ended up choosing some of the Jedi companions or companions with force powers. The difficulty of this game, I think, is an interesting topic. I don't really know what the prevailing sentiment is, if this is a hard game or an easy game. I think overall this game is pretty easy, actually. I feel this way about KOTOR 1 as well. The systems are pretty easy to manipulate. The game gives you a lot of armor pieces or equipment and opportunities to really min-max your character. There is no way to reset your character, though, so I would recommend, I guess, if you're taking a first shot at this game, to maybe utilize a guide to like at least come up with an idea of how you want to build your character before you start, just because you can't reset it. That's the only reason I really say that. There's most of the builds that you could come up with. If you're putting some thought into it, you're probably going to do fine in this game, because you really do get to pretty well max out your character, even if you're just doing like a decent number of the side quests. That being said, there are, especially early in the game, due to the game's structure, some strong difficulty spikes. So the game lets you visit any planet in any order, after the first planet. And so I don't think the game makes any effort to change the difficulty of these planets depending on the order in which you encounter them. So, they're kind of all balanced flatly. So, by that very nature of the way that seems to work, the first planet you visit is going to be difficult because you're underleveled, and then the last planet you visit is going to be really easy because you're going to be really overleveled. So, the first planet I visited was Dantooine, and while generally I felt it was still pretty easy, it involved a lot of pausing and planning for different combat encounters. There were a couple of situations that I just felt massively underleveled for, to the point where I really just had to find a way to cheese my way through it. Yeah, there was also, even in the second planet I visited, Nar Shaddaa, there was a situation in which I definitely had to cheese the game to get through it. That being said, by the time you get to, the later planets in the game, you're going to be pretty overleveled. And if you've made an effort to, build a fairly balanced character and focus in on some, particular force powers, you're going to breeze through the end of the game. This is not as a particularly difficult game, at least is how I felt about it. But I'll kind of start with this. I actually feel like that difficulty, whether intentional or not, really feeds really well into the story. This game is all about you as a Jedi exile, a warrior from the Mandalorian Wars. You come back to the galaxy, and the galaxy is in a state of it's in a rough state post Knights of the Old Republic. The Sith are kind of hunting what remains of the Jedi. You're trying to figure out, where are these Sith coming from, how do we stop them, and how do we kind of galvanize and get together the Jedi that are left to form a resistance. That's kind of the gist of it. I won't get into the spoilers, at least not in this section, but that's the gist of it. Throughout the course of this, you go from a Jedi that was cut off from the Force to a Jedi that rekindles his affinity with the Force, and you grow quite powerful, and that becomes a key element of this game's story, I would say. And so I think that kind of ties well into that journey of difficulty, where the early parts of the game are genuinely harder than the later parts of the game. It seems like that would be the case for this character, where you are really struggling to find your way early in the game, and by the end you really are a force to be reckoned with and are intimidating to many. And so I think whether intentionally or not, that difficulty path actually kind of follows the story path of the game. The game is a direct sequel to Knights of the Old Republic. I'm trying to avoid spoilers of Knights of the Old Republic as well. Hopefully I won't let anything slip, but generally the games do tie together, but this is a fairly self-contained story. There are obvious hints to KOTOR 1, and you get a lot more out of it. Had you played KOTOR 1? So if you never played either, I would recommend playing the first one first. Certainly because they're very similar games, and if you enjoy one, you're going to enjoy two, or vice versa. That being said, the story is fairly self-contained and could be enjoyed as its own thing. It's a lot darker than Knights of the Old Republic 1. Certainly one of the darkest Star Wars stories that I think I've ever encountered. But it's extremely well written. The characters are very thoughtful. They all kind of carry, I would say, kind of philosophical views on both the Force and the Jedi and the Sith. So many of them carry such deep and thoughtful views on the galaxy in Star Wars, and it's just very enriching from a perspective of Star Wars as a medium. I think these characters shine as some of the best that exist in Star Wars. Characters like Kreia, this gray Jedi that you meet early on, that's very mysterious. You don't really know what's going on with her. Without spoilers, she has quite the journey. Atton, your pilot, same thing there. You meet a bounty hunter, and her turmoil with another bounty hunter is a fascinating story. All of these characters have truly interesting stories that almost seem like they could be self-contained, novels or people that would be a primary protagonist, right, in a story. And then you have a good and satisfying journey as well in this game. I think it all ties together nicely. There are flaws with, as I talked about earlier, like certain quest lines and plot lines not being seen all the way through. There is, of course, the wonderful restored content mod for those playing this game on PC, and that legitimately restores portions of the game that the developers had almost finished but didn't get into the final release of the game back in 2004. So that's awesome, and like that, I used that for this playthrough, and that filled in some of the gaps. I will say, even with that in place, the game still feels unfinished. That's my primary flaw with the game. It's an old game, so I don't really think it's worth... I don't even have a slide for it talking about graphics or anything like that. The game looks good. It's got cool environments and interesting... it's an interesting kind of views on Star Wars environments. I think they're fun to explore. And I think that some of the character designs, like the physical designs of the characters, are really striking and cool. Darth Nihilus, like the character on the cover of the game, and that was on the first page of this PowerPoint. I think he's like a really cool character. Like, it's just a really cool character design. So I think that matters a lot more than like the quote unquote graphics of the game. So, what are my overall thoughts? I think I've kind of summarized them all. I'm trying to keep this video short, and the spoiler-free section of this video is about 16 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap it up, the whole thing, before 20 minutes. Didn't meet my goal, but it's still fairly short. I'm going to give this game a 9 out of 10. I debated giving this game a 10 out of 10, because for me personally, this game is a 10 out of 10. It's one of my favorite video games that's ever been made. It's top 5 for me, for sure. So much of that, though, is based off of my love of Star Wars, and this being some of the most enriching and powerful Star Wars content that exists. So if you love Star Wars, like, you're getting some of the best Star Wars stories I think ever told in this video game. Really, without question, like, the writing in this game shines above really anything I've seen in almost any other video game. The gameplay is good. It's not incredible, but I would still give it a 10 out of 10 if it was just the gameplay. The thing that makes me just say, like, even though this is in my top 5, maybe even might even be number 1 for me personally, in terms of video games, the game's unfinished. It just isn't finished. If it was finished, it would be a perfect video game in my mind. So it's a real shame that it isn't. But that being said, I would absolutely recommend playing this game. Obviously, recently announced was the Fate of the New Republic, I believe, or Fate of the Old Republic, I am pretty sure is the name of the game, coming up. And so, like, certainly, like, I'm sure there'll be callbacks and things to KOTOR 1 and KOTOR 2, even though it's said that it's not going to directly connect. I think, worth playing, especially if you're thinking about checking out that game and you never have played it before. So overall, excellent video game. 9 out of 10. Check it out. Okay, so that's 18 minutes. I am now going to get into just a few spoiler thoughts. Try to keep them fairly brief. So spoilers for this point out. I think your journey as a main character, losing the Force and then getting it back, and kind of the way that impacts the characters around you. You have the ability to influence your party members in a way that's like tie in the story, right? Like, it's not just a gameplay mechanic of like, oh, I'm influencing them, they're becoming better. Like, you are so powerful in the Force that like you are influencing them through the Force, and like whether or not that's a good thing, is that appropriate, like, is something that the characters in the game discuss, and like the Jedi Council frowns upon you for having this influence on people, which I think is fascinating. You as being like this charismatic leader, but like, are you actually manipulating people, because it involves like the manipulation of the Force. I think that's all fascinating, and this is a topic that's actually discussed in the game. And then Kreia, this dark, or gray Jedi at first, that becomes clear that she is a Sith by the end of the game. Her journey and her like influence on you, your influence on her, her infatuation with you due to the fact that you're like a place in which the Force cannot exist, is fascinating. Then your kind of like juxtaposition to the main villain, Darth Nihilus, who like consumes the Force and is not like a hole in the Force, but like almost like a gluttonous explosion of force. I don't even know how to explain it. Like he's literally like just sucking the force out of life, and consuming it, whereas like you are kind of a hole in the force. I think that juxtaposition is really fascinating as well. All the characters are well written. Some of the characters, the side characters, like God, they have like such dark and mysterious pasts. Like Atten the pilot, you know, and his kind of prior transgressions against Jedi and hatred for them, I think is fascinating, and how he comes to terms with that. You know, if you take the light side path in the game, and then you know, I can't remember the name of the bounty hunter, but her journey with not Zalbar, that's the Wookiee from the first game, but the Wookiee in this game that's also a bounty hunter, like owing her a life debt, and her wanting to not kill him because she has a moral like dilemma with killing people, but then him just hunting her endlessly because of how much he hates her, even though he owes her a life debt. I think, you know, that was all. I'm not doing it justice with like, because that sounded like a soap opera, but like it's actually it plays out really in interesting ways. So I think all these characters are incredibly fascinating, and I think that's what makes this game so special. These characters, is this story that they tell. And while there are like unfinished parts of the game, they are mostly like side bits. Like the overall story does feel like you get a full tale, I guess I should say, even if there are seemingly pieces missing throughout it. In its entirety, you definitely see your character go through the full journey, as well as the majority of the side characters. And their story content helps with some of the other ones, like the HK-47 having a little bit more of a story was nice, although I didn't find that one to be quite as impactful as some of the others anyways. So I guess with those are my thoughts on Knights of the Old Republic 2. Again, it's a 9 out of 10 overall because it has some somewhat fatal flaws, but in terms of it getting a 10 out of 10 realistically, but it is a 10 out of 10 in my heart, and a game that I think you should check out. So if you are still listening, thanks for listening. I don't know when I'll post another review, but whenever I finish my next game. Thanks guys, and hope to see you then.